on this computer. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I just know I go back and rewatch the videos myself a lot.
Okay. Well, let's start over then, since I didn't record as I should have. Okay, rehash from last week. The issue that we talked about last week, who qualifies as a minister? I didn't address the question of why is that important. The importance is, the importance is because certain things that you qualify for as a minister, mainly housing allowance and exemption from Social Security or Medicare, are only eligible to be done if you qualify as a minister. And as we talked about last week, the primary issue, the primary driver there is if you are commissioned, licensed, or ordained as a minister. However, the courts have told us that if you are part of a body that does not commission, ordain, or license ministers, then you are actually fulfilling that obligation by actually starting to do the work of a minister. So the caveat or the flip side of that is if you are a part of a body that does commission, ordain, or license minister, until you are commissioned, ordained, or licensed, you cannot be considered to be a minister and cannot receive any of the benefits tax-wise that a minister would get. So, are you self-employed or an employee? The easy answer is yes. The IRS deems that all ministers are employees for income tax purposes, but are self-employed for Social Security tax purposes. As such, ministers should be issued a W-2 instead of a 1099. If they issue a 1099, they're saying that you're self-employed. If they issue you a W-2, they're understanding that you are an employee. Here's what a W-2 would look like for a minister. It would have the minister's Social Security number, the church's EIN, their name and address, the minister's name and address, and then in box 1, wages, tips, and other compensation, would have their salary net of housing allowance. In box 14 would have the housing allowance amount. And then box 15 would have their state reporting information if they have to report for a state income tax for income tax purposes. So this gentleman makes $70,000 a year. He has a housing allowance of $22,500. So the total he makes, that $70,000, gets split into housing allowance going in box 14, and his net salary of $47,500 going in box 1. Now, when he goes to fill out his tax return, there'll be some wrinkles in there that we'll talk about later on, but the housing allowance is not taxable income. The salary is taxable income. We will talk January the 11th on maximizing the benefit of the housing allowance. And there's some rules around how much you can claim, et cetera, et cetera. But housing allowance is one of the big benefits that we will talk about as benefiting the minister. So what difference does it make if you're employee, or self-employed? If you're self-employed, you pay a Social Security tax of 15.3%. If your wages go on an employee, their wages go on the front of 1040 on line 7. A self-employed individual reports their income on Schedule C. If you have expenses, business expenses, and we'll talk about business expenses January the 25th of next year in that class. If you report business expenses, they go on a 2106, unreimbursed employee business expense for an employee, and then that flows into Schedule A as a miscellaneous itemized deduction, and you lose 2% of adjusted gross income in trying to deduct miscellaneous itemized deductions. However, if you're a self-employed individual, your expenses go on Schedule C to offset your income there. If you are an employee, the church can provide you fringe benefits and they can be tax-free. If you are self-employed, anything the church does for you from a fringe benefit standpoint should be reported as additional income. So, for example, if the church paid medical insurance premiums on your behalf, if you're an employee, that can be a tax-free fringe benefit. If you're not an employee, any medical insurance they pay on your behalf, any premiums they pay, that goes on your 1099 as additional income. Another example, anybody, a company can provide up to $5,250 a year in education tuition coverage payments. If you are an employee, that would be a fringe benefit that's tax-free. If you're self-employed, that would be additional income to you. There are also limitations on, if you're self-employed, which retirement plans you might participate in. And then you have to look at, if you are charged with misconduct, if you're self-employed, who's liable for that misconduct? You don't have any coverage or any shelter under the church as you were acting in their behalf. You're self-employed. So there are issues with being an employee that most people don't even think about when they get that 1099 and just report it on their W-2. So how is the status determined? The IRS has both a 3-factor test and a 20-factor test, and we'll look at both of those here in a few minutes. The tax court has a 7-factor test. The Supreme Court has a 12-factor test. The income tax regulations include a corporate officer test, and a lot of times, well, I say a lot of times, it's rare, but they could potentially claim that a minister is a corporate officer, and as such, look at their test about whether or not he qualifies as an employee. So let's talk about first the IRS's 3-factor test. All these tests look at a variation of what degree of control and the degree of independence there is among the parties. The 3-factor test looks at, in broad terms, behavioral control, financial control, and the type of relationship. That's very broad, so let's look at the 20-factor test that the IRS would look at. These are the types of questions, and there's 20 questions here that we're going to talk about. Is the worker required to comply with instructions about when, where, and how to work? So, Justin, if you were to go up to your eldership or the men at the congregation and say, I don't think I want to preach Sundays, what do you think they'd say? They are going to require that you comply with instructions about when, where, and how to work.
Yes, sir.
I don't mind preaching on Sunday, but let me preach from, the back garden at my house as opposed to coming up to the building. No, they're going to ask you, they're going to instruct you on when, how, and where to work. Is the worker trained by an experienced employee or by other means? If you are, this one is probably not as important in a minister situation as it would be in other employee-employer relationships. But if you took a job as a intern or as a youth minister, it would not be unusual for the minister to spend time doing things with you to help you train and understand what your job duties are, etc. So that, once again, could be a factor in this. Are the workers' services integrated into the employer's business operations? Now, obviously, these things are written for general business use. So as a minister, what you are doing is very much integrated into what the church is doing. So I think the first question here and this question both you'd have to very vehemently say, yes, the ministry is required and their services are integrated into what's going on in the church. Must services be rendered personally by the worker? Once again, I think that would be a definitive yes. You have to do what you've agreed to do. So that's three out of the first four that we've definitely said are going to be a yes. Does the church hire, supervise, and pay assistants to assist the worker? Maybe, maybe not. That one may be a moot point. May not, the church may hire a secretary and they may be doing things to assist the minister or not. But that one may not be as important as some of these others. Is there a continuing working relationship between the church and the worker? Yes, there's definitely a continuing working relationship there. Does the employer establish set hours of work? Now, I know as a minister, I grew up as a child of a minister, so I understand that you're basically working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I understand that. But they do establish certain times that you should be there and certain functions you should perform while you are there, particularly worship service on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, whenever it may be. You have to be there, and they establish certain hours of work. There's a certain expectation that you'll be visiting shut-ins and at the hospitals and whatever else may be going on, and you may even have set office hours. So I think a definitive yes there, that they do establish certain expectations for hours of work. Must a worker devote full time to the church's business? This, you can have part-time ministers, and I've known a few over the years, but as a general rule, most ministers are going to be full-time, and they should devote full-time to whatever the church is doing. So out of the first, 8 questions, I think we've come up with at least 6 that are a definite yes. Number 9, must the worker perform his duties on the church's premises? Some duties, yes. Preaching and teaching on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, yes. Other duties, maybe not. Must a worker, well, what happened there? Okay. Must a worker perform services in an order or sequence set by the church? That one may not be as important as some of these others, but there may be situations where there are certain things that you have to do in a certain order. Is the worker required to submit regular oral or written reports? I don't know about you and your situation, but there may very well be regular meetings with the leadership to talk about what's going on and those sorts of things. Is the worker paid by the hour, by the week, or by the month? I know in our situation, we generally have a salary amount that we split over 52 weeks and pay the minister that amount 52 times a year. So we set a salary and just pay it regularly. We don't pay by the hour. We do pay office help and some of those sort of things by the hour. But minister, we treat as a salaried employee. Does the church pay the workers' business expenses? And if the answer to this is yes, then once again, that's an argument that you're an employee, that you're not self-employed, because then you would be liable for paying your own business expenses. And as we talk through some of these things, talking about business expenses later on in the quarter, we'll give you some recommendations where it may be beneficial to you to forego a raise and set up a pot of dollars to be reimbursed for business expenses. We'll talk through some of those issues. But as far as just the employer-employee relationship, the church reimbursing business expenses or paying directly for business expenses argues for that employee relationship. Does the church furnish tools and materials for the workers' use? Now here, a lot of ministers will make arguments, and we'll see some tax cases later on, where they furnish their Bible, they furnish their library, they furnish maybe even their software and their hardware they're running, PowerPoint on, et cetera, et cetera. So this may be one that argues that you are not that employee, but the preponderance of evidence of these 20 items is what we're going to be looking at. Does the church furnish all necessary facilities, both equipment and premises? I think we could easily say the church is going to provide whatever necessary premises there may be, but the equipment may fall under the same argument as the previous one. You may be providing some of your own there, but as a general rule, the facilities, the premises, the church is going to provide. May the worker realize a profit or suffer a loss as a result of his services. You don't have a profit potential here. They're not going to pay you more or pay you less if you do or don't do certain, it's not like you're going out and hiring yourself out to somebody to try to make a profit in doing a business transaction. Does the worker perform services for a number of other organizations? Now, if you were the old circuit rider preacher and spoke in 4 or 5 different places every month, you might be eligible here to claim that you're self-employed. But as a general rule, a full-time person working at a single congregation, they're not going to make that argument that they're self-employed. They're an employee. They're only providing services for one person or one congregation. Does the worker make his services available to the general public? You might argue here that for weddings or funerals or certain other things, marriage counseling, whatever it may be, that you might make services available to the general public, but that's a minimal part of what you do as a minister. So you're not really holding yourself out to the general public as being available to be a minister for them outside of that relationship with the congregation there. Can the church dismiss the worker at any time? And as a general rule, you may have a limitation on how much time they have to give you, a 2-week notice or a month notice or whatever it may be. But as a general rule, the church can dismiss a minister at pretty much any time. Can the worker end the relationship with the church at any time without incurring liability? And the flip side of what we just discussed about the church dismissing the worker, the minister generally can end the relationship without incurring some additional liability. And the contrast here that they're trying to get to, if you hired somebody, for example, to replace the baptistry in the church building, and they came in and started the work and said, no, we're done. We're not going to do it. We didn't finish what we said we'd do, but we're just going to quit. They had agreed to do a certain piece of work for you, and they just didn't do it. So they've got some additional liability to fulfill that obligation that they had with you. So out of those 20 questions that we've talked about, as I think you can see that the vast majority of them, if it ever came down to a question regarding employee or self-employed, looking at the preponderance of evidence of those 20 questions, I suspect that most people, if they went down and said yes or no to each one of these, would come out with a minimum 13 to 15 saying, yes, I'm an employee. Don't know if you tried to keep score as we went through, but as a general rule, there's 2 or 3 that really don't apply here. But as a general rule, I think we'd see that, yes, the preponderance, more than 3/4 of them are probably going to point to being a minister. Now, I will tell you one example I've got, a situation that happened in 2005. Local church had only one employee, and that was the minister. They were paying him as an employee. They were filing payroll tax returns, showing his salary as and his W-2 amounts on the payroll tax returns. They gave him a W-2 at the end of the year. However, the dollars that they totaled up on their quarterly payroll tax returns did not agree to the dollars they put on his W-2. So the IRS looked at that and said, we're going to make an adjustment, and we're going to pick the higher dollar amount, and we're also going to assess upon the church payroll taxes related to that. Well, the problem is the minister was exempt from payroll tax. He had elected out of Social Security and Medicare, and the church, as a church, does not treat him as an employee for payroll tax purposes. That's what we said on slide number 1, you know. But the IRS did that. So they assessed payroll taxes on that difference in income. And the church tried from 2005 until 2010 to fix the issue. And then somebody that I had done work with over the years came to me and said, can you work on this issue for us? So I agreed, and I tried from 2011 up until 2016 before the IRS finally agreed that what they had done was incorrect, that they shouldn't have assessed that additional tax, and finally wiped off whatever tax liability they were showing for the church. So it can get complicated. It can get difficult to fix if an error shows up. But it as a general rule, the standard rule the IRS has, you're an employee for W-2 employment tax, income tax purposes, but you're self-employed for Social Security purposes. So your W-2 just does not have any withholding for Social Security or Medicare. The church is not required to withhold. I lost you. I see you're back. You back with me? Are you there? I hear you now. I hear something now. You back with me, Justin?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's the internet glitch.
I figured it was. The church is not required to withhold income tax on the minister. As you saw on the W-2 we looked at earlier, there was nothing in the income tax withheld, either state or federal box. However, you as a minister can ask, and the church can agree, does not have to agree, they're not required to, but can agree to withhold if you would so like for them to do so. And they can pay in, as opposed to you paying estimated tax payments, they can pay in and withhold and pay in payroll taxes or income taxes on your behalf. Brian says he's got 2 sick babies. So, all right, he says he's got 2 sick babies, so he won't be able to join us tonight. Okay, so just keep in the back of your mind, if it's if you'd rather the church withhold and not pay that income tax to you, you can ask. They don't have to agree to it, but if they do, then they assume that responsibility of paying that income tax in on your behalf. All right, let's look at some court cases. I've listed 5 court cases here, and the 3 that here are listed as self-employed we're going to talk through for a little bit. Alford being the first one, which is 1997 case. Alford was an ordained Assemblies of God minister. His status as self-employed was determined by the lack of control of the local church over his activities. He supplied his own furniture. He supplied the equipment he used in his daily functions. He set his own schedule. So the court, this one actually went to court. The IRS arguing that he was an employee and was being treated improperly. He argued he was self-employed, and the court in this case in 1997 agreed with him because he basically was doing his own thing, although he was ordained by the Assemblies of God as a minister. He wasn't being told by them where to go or what to do or when to do it. He provided all his own furniture, all his own equipment, set his own schedule. The church had very limited control over what he did. So in that case, because of the limitation of control by the church over what he did, the courts held that he was self-employed. The next was Shelley, a 1994 case, a Pentecostal holiness minister. He was hired for his specialized skills and his style. He was chair of the church board with the authority to appoint other members of the board. The church board did not supervise or evaluate him, paid for his own continuing education, used his own library. Because he had so much control, because he basically hired himself, the courts in this case, 1994, declared that he was a self-employed individual. Green, a 1996 case, an Assemblies of God foreign minister, foreign missionary. He raised his own support, even hired and paid others to assist in raising support for him. He decided where he would go to establish his ministry, decided what services would be available through his ministry, decided when he would leave his ministry. And in this case, the courts decided that because of the call he established over what he did, when he did it, how he did it, etc., that and even raising his own funds, etc., hiring people to help him raise funds, all those issues, they deemed him to be a self-employed individual. There are some other situations where you may truly be a self-employed person. If you're a guest speaker for a summer series, a lecture series, you go to polishing the pulpit, you hold gospel meetings. In those situations, you would be self-employed for those types of monies. If you provide services directly to members, such as weddings or funerals or whatever, and they give you a gratuity or pay you to do a wedding or hold a funeral or whatever it may be, if you do some counseling and they pay you for that, you would be self-employed as far as that is concerned. So as a general rule, a minister who is full-time work somewhere at a congregation, but does summer series or weddings or funerals or gospel meetings or speaks at PTP or lectureships or whatever it may be, is really going to have two pools of income. They're going to have a W-2 income from the church, and they're going to have 1099 income from all those other places where they perform services. Now, you may not receive a 1099. Whenever we hire a gospel meeting or a preacher for a gospel meeting, or whenever we do summer series, if I don't pay $600 or more to someone, I don't send them a 1099. And that is the IRS rule. If it exceeds $600, you have to exceed it. You have to send them a 1099. If it does not exceed $600, then you don't have to send them a 1099. And because I'm sending out 20 or 30 1099s every year, I just choose to limit how much work I have to do and not send out 1099s to those guys that we paid less than $600 to. So it would not be uncommon for you to have a situation on your tax return where you're an employee, you get a W-2 from your church, but you're self-employed, not only for your ministerial functions of self-employment tax, but for all these other things where you get monies from other places for doing work. Okay? Another example we gave, itinerant evangelist. There are people out there that they're not at an established congregation. They just here and there. It's not truly the circuit rider preacher anymore, but they're here for 2 months or there for 3 months, or the guy that's going around holding singing classes, or the guy that's going around holding wedding seminars, marriage seminars. Those guys, they're itinerant evangelists, they're itinerant ministers. They're going around a number of places, and those people probably would be counted as self-employed. They're holding out their services to multiple parties. They're getting hired by multiple parties. They're not in any one established place drawing a salary. So those people would be self-employed individuals. You take somebody where he and his wife do marriage seminars, and you pay both of them, and she's talking to the ladies while he's talking to the men, and then they come together and he's talking to the group combined. The two of them would to some extent be both self-employed. So yes, there may be situations where you have a mix of self-employed versus employee, but as a general rule, whatever you get paid by the church where you work regularly, you're going to be an employee, should get a W-2. Reminder, the IRS will always claim that a minister is an employee for income tax purposes. It's what we saw on the first slide. You're self-employed for self-employment tax or Social Security tax purposes, but you're always deemed in the IRS eyes to be an employee for income tax purposes. So the 3 court cases that we looked at where the courts deemed them to be self-employed, the IRS came in and said they were filing their income taxes incorrectly and that they should have been employees. That's where the court case started. Most ministers will have a mixture of employee and self-employed income, all the self-employed income coming from weddings or meetings or lectureships, summer series, whatever it may be. Self-employed or employee in business has been a major issue since before 1978. Congress in 1978 passed the Revenue Act of 78. And in that Revenue Act of 78, they put in a safe harbor provision, which is called Section 530. That safe harbor says if in your industry it's common to treat someone as a contractor, and if you do the right paperwork and file 1099s with the IRS and file 1099s with the contractor, then you have a safe harbor that the IRS cannot go back and reclassify all that you paid them as employee payments, payroll, and assess payroll taxes on that. Now, the problem with the IRS assessing payroll taxes is that the employer has to come out of pocket for all of that. So, if you have a situation where a guy hires a bunch of people and treats them all as contractors, but he should be treating them as employees, and the IRS comes in and catches them, then whatever he paid them, they're going to assess 15.3% payroll tax, Social Security, Medicare tax, plus probably 6 to 10% in payroll tax withholding, income tax withholding. So they're going to probably assess between 20 and 25% in payroll taxes on what he should have paid, on what he should have been paying into the IRS as he was paying these employees. So a guy comes in and pays you $30,000 on a 1099, and he should have given you a W-2. He's going to have to cough up, if the IRS catches him, he's going to have to cough up probably $7,500 just on that 1099 he gave you, because he should have been treating it as treating you as an employee. But let's talk about what we saw on the W-2. For the church, they're not required to withhold income tax. They're not required to withhold payroll taxes, Social Security and Medicare. You're self-employed for those purposes. So if the church sends you a 1099 and should be giving you a W-2, what's the penalty? They're not required to withhold. The only issue, the major issue with getting a 1099 instead of a W-2 is what number are you going to put in box 7 of the 1099 for non-employee compensation. For our example of the guy that's making 70 grand with 22.5 being housing allowance, are you going to put the 70? Are you going to put the 47.5? If you put the 70, how are you going to tell him about the 22.5 housing allowance? If you put the 47.5, how are you going to tell him about the 22.5? He doesn't know what the housing allowance is. The IRS doesn't get any information about it. So that's the issue. The IRS did begin in 2012 a program that they call a VCAP, Voluntary Classification Settlement Program, where you could come forth and say, I've been treating these people like employee or like contractors. I should have been treating them like employees. And you can voluntarily enter into an agreement with the IRS and fix the issue. For a minister, for a church, I've never seen one participate in something like that. My advice would be, if you're in a situation and they want to fix it, just start doing it proactively, correctly, start issuing W-2s. And since I don't feel there's a penalty for having done it incorrectly, I would just let the IRS bring it up if they choose to do so. So I believe that's, we're to the questions point. So any questions?
No, sir. Just based on what you said we're going to cover in the future.
Okay. Yeah, we'll cover a lot of other things, and I sent attached to the email, so you can tell me if it came through, a PDF of the future classes.
Yes, sir. That came through. Are you going to be sending your PowerPoints out like you did last week?
I meant to do that. I just didn't do it today. I will do that. I'll send them out after class here. Yes, and I'm trying to get all the ones organized. In fact, that's what I was doing for about 30 minutes before you joined in, trying to get everything organized so I can have everything ready for future classes. So I'll try to go ahead and send those out tonight, and then I may just send a bulk set out earlier, and they're dated. The slide shows are dated based on when we're supposed to have the class.
Okay. Yes,
sir. So next week we will be talking about electing out of Social Security and Medicare. There's some issues around that. And as you saw on the schedule I sent out, we're going to have an essay report that is due, and I'll go ahead and tell you what that is. I can argue either side of whether or not a minister should elect out of Social Security or Medicare. I have what I think are valid arguments for yes and valid arguments for no. So the essay requirement to be due the last day of class, will be to pick either a yes or a no answer, should or should you not opt out of Social Security or Medicare, and write an essay on why. So we'll have a setting for that next week. We'll be talking about that issue of opting out of Social Security and Medicare. And that will be part of your final grade, and part of the final exam is that essay question. So if you have no other, let me just stop that share and get, okay. All right. If there are no other questions or nothing else, then I will pause this or stop this recording and post it up. I will send out the slideshow or the PowerPoint slides as well. And anything else?
No, sir. That's
all right. The next week we'll talk about the issues around electing out of Social Security, Medicare. We will have a break then until January the 4th, in which case, at which time we will come back and talk about what is income for the minister and various and sundry other things. But you've got the schedule in front of you. I'll send out the other stuff now after this, and we will go from there. Appreciate it, Justin.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.